One of the most ruthless and brutal periods of history was the French Revolution. Despite the huge amount of change that was brought into the nation, there was a colossal amount of torture and executions, as over 17,000 people were dragged to the guillotine for their deaths for harbouring any form of pro-monarchist sentiment. The reign of terror that came following the deposing of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette was ruthless, and if a wife shed a tear for her husband as he lost his head on the guillotine, she could then face the same sort of punishment, as the tears were seen as anti-revolutionary. The king and queen would also be executed, but what is not as well known about the aftermath of this was that the French people and revolutionaries launched a stunning attack on previous monarchs and kings and the tombs and remains of those who had ruled over the country previously. There was a huge amount of desecration of the king's and queen's remains. Crypts were broken into, tombs were smashed up and raided, and burial vaults were looted. But the corpses of a number of the kings and queens were also taken and still remain missing today. Join as we look at this strange period of time and the desecration of the royal burial vaults. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In July of 1793, following the first anniversary of the Declaration of the French Republic that deposed the French monarchy, the new government ordered a decree that caused chaos. They wanted to punish the former kings and queens who they regarded as tyrants, and they wanted to also wipe the monarchs off the face of the nation and also from the memory of people. With this, the National Convention ordered the desecration and destruction of ancient royal tombs. At the time, the majority of these were inside of the Basilica of St Denis, close to Paris, which had become a royal mausoleum. With this, groups raided the church and they stole the coffins of the former kings and queens. Also stolen were the visceral urns of the former monarchs. These contained the hearts and entrails of them, which had been cut out of their bodies following their death. The crypts were opened and the remains were taken out of the chapel, and they were dumped in large trenches which had been dug up. The corpses were thrown into these pits, and then the revolutionaries threw quicklime solution onto the bodies to decay them and to then dissolve the corpses quicker. Later, in 1817, the briefly restored monarchy sought to return the remains to the Basilica, and they could only find the lower parts of 3 corpses and the fragments of 158 members of the royal family were later placed inside of ossuaries inside of the crypt. There was very little left of the former kings and queens of France, but inside of the churches there were further desecration as monuments were stolen and smashed, and there was a huge amount of damage. It was an attack on the old order which had been overthrown, and some who witnessed the exhumations and the desecration were even shocked by what they saw. It was a symbol to end the monarchy and an attempt to wipe those from history, and one man who witnessed the events claimed that God would annihilate an entire race and scattered its buried ancestors, and he believed that this was what had previously been warned about in the Bible. The exhumations had been little documented over the years. They were spoke about a lot at the time, and they were a rather important event. The exhumations were performed whilst many officials looked on, and whilst a large crowd made up of many people from the former monks of the chapel to the staunch revolutionaries looked on. The corpses were removed from the sarcophagi inside of the upper church and then taken from the coffins. There was a brief examination to see what state the remains were in, and it was claimed that the majority of the ancient dynastic monarchs' corpses had been reduced to ash, but the later kings and queens of France had been well preserved, but there were some who, despite the embalming process occurred, were in a bad way. The Bourbon monarchs were known for being in a state, and it was said that the putrefied bodies of some emitted a malodorous black vapour that sickened workers before it was checked with vinegar, and burnt saltpetre. Inside of the central Bourbon crypt, one of the first coffins opened and broken into was that of King Henry IV. Under the light of torches, the corpses were lifted out of the coffin, and the remains were said to have been very well preserved. It was classed as a miracle, and a cast was taken of his face, showing the deceased king's face with his beard full, his eyes shut, and his face looking as if he died just days before. The corpse of Henry IV was then briefly inside of the choir before it was dumped into the trench outside. There was one corpse which was left alone, though. This was that of King Louis XIV, Supreme's commander, Henry de la Tour d'Aravigne. He was considered at the time the greatest general, and his coffin was opened as the crowd wanted to pay their respects to him. His body was said to have been odourless and intact, and a drawing was made of his body. It had been wrapped in a shroud, and this was uncovered, and it showed the brutal wound that he had died from, a cannonball being shot into his stomach. But the sight of his body stirred up some patriotism along the revolutionaries. There were a number of pieces of the remains of the former monarchs taken. People pulled teeth from the dead and then later tried to sell them. One man who saw the chaos claimed that I had the pleasure of touching these venerable remains. I took his hands with a certain respect that I could not resist, as true a republican as I am. He later saw a soldier who lifted up one of the corpses and then cut a lock off the red beard. Things became violent inside of the crypts because of the anger that the kings and queens represented at the time. A woman approached one of the corpses and swore at it, and then kicked it, which was so brutal that it was knocked from the plinth where it was placed. The coffin of Marie de Medici, the second wife of Henry IV, was opened, and some bones were found inside of muddy water or liquid, and 2 workers scooped them out, and then insults were thrown at her remains for the rest of the day. People pulled pieces of her hair from her skull and distributed them, and they then turned to the body of Anne of Austria. Her casket was opened, and they found her putrefied body, which was wrapped in a thick red cloth. This was then displayed. Some people inside of the local area even began to collect royal voyagers' parts, and one man had taken a section of St. Louis's skull, the teeth of King Henry III, and the leg of Catherine de Medici. 21 coffins had been broken into on the 16th of October 1793, and the remains were then thrown into a pit. One eyewitness claimed most of the bodies were decaying. A foul-smelling, thick black vapour was released, which they desperately tried to dispel with vinegar and powder that they had taken the precaution of burning, which did not prevent the workmen from feeling unwell and feverish, but without consequence. In total, 46 kings, 32 queens, and members of the royal family, totalling 170 people, had their tombs smashed open, coffins cracked open, and their bodies exhumed. All of them then had their bodies dumped unceremoniously inside of trenches outside of the church, and one trench was for the Valois and the other was for the Bourbons. A huge crowd gathered to witness the burial of the bodies, and the lime was poured into the grave to dissolve the remains quicker, but also to keep the smell down as the bodies stank. Later, the Basilica of St Denis was reconsecrated, and as mentioned, the remains were attempted to be returned to the grave, but it was impossible to do this. The desecration of the royal tombs inside of France was a brutal and rough event, one which shocked and horrified many people, but also the corpses of a British king, James II, was targeted, and his corpse was taken away and dealt with, despite him not being a French king. No nation on earth went to the extremes that the French did to destroy the bodies of the kings and queens that reigned over them. It was a harrowing event. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.